The walk through the glittering lobby felt like a dream. The same people who had watched with pity or annoyance earlier now offered small, kind smiles as Leo and his mother passed. The manager, looking both relieved and deeply impressed, gave a respectful nod as they neared the service entrance. But Leo didn't really see them. His mind was still back at the piano, feeling the last vibrations in his fingertips. And then, on the heavy white card now tucked safely in his mother's pocket, the moment the heavy service door swung shut behind them, the world changed. The cool, flower-scented air was replaced by the familiar smell of cleaning supplies and warm concrete. The hushed elegance was swapped for the distant hum of industrial dryers and the clang of a laundry cart. They were back in their world. His mother didn't say a word. She just put her arm tightly around his shoulders as they walked down the plain corridor, past stacks of linens and trolleys of supplies. Her grip was strong, saying everything her voice couldn't. They took the staff elevator down to the basement, the rattling cage a stark contrast to the guests' smooth. Silent lifts upstairs. It wasn't until they were outside, the city's evening noise wrapping around them, the rumble of buses, the chatter of people, the blare of a distant horn, that she finally stopped. They were in the alley behind the hotel, near the big dumpsters. She turned him to face her, her hands on both his shoulders. Her eyes searched his face. "That music," she said, her voice quiet against the city's din. "All that? That was in you? All this time?" Leo nodded, suddenly feeling shy. "It's just the sounds from home," he mumbled, looking at his sneakers. "The washing machine. The leak. You humming." A soft sob escaped her, but it was a happy sound. She pulled him into a tight hug, burying her face in his hair. "You foolish, wonderful boy," she whispered, her voice choked. "You scared me to death. And then you made my heart feel like it would fly away." They walked home, hand in hand, but it wasn't the same walk as always. Usually they were both tired, lost in their own thoughts about the long day and the longer tomorrow. Tonight, the air seemed to crackle with a new energy. They talked in bursts. What did he mean? Scales and theory. Leo asked. "Hard work," his mother said, squeezing his hand. "The kind that makes your brain and your fingers ache. Are you ready for that? Not just playing, but studying." "Yes," he said immediately, with the absolute certainty of a child who has finally found the key to a secret garden at home. In their small, warm apartment, the ordinary felt different. The chalk-drawn keyboard on his bedroom floor, which had always been a place of escape, now looked like a map that had led to a real treasure. His mother took Mr. Thorne's card from her pocket and placed it carefully on the kitchen table, smoothing its edges. It looked foreign there, on the scratched wooden surface next to the sugar bowl. "We will call," she said, more to herself than to him. "We will see what this means." The next week was a strange mix of the normal and the nerve-wracking. Life went on. His mother went to her cleaning jobs. Leo went to school. But the card on the table was a constant presence. When the day came to call, his mother's hands trembled as she dialed the number on their old wall phone. She spoke quietly, formally, to a polite woman on the other end. She used words like audition and scholarship, words that felt heavy and new in her mouth. An appointment was set. The city conservatory. Saturday morning got the night before. Leo couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, not imagining the piano this time, but imagining a room full of serious-faced teachers like Mr. Thorne, all waiting for him to prove himself. The fear was a cold knot in his stomach. What if the hotel had been a fluke? What if he sat down and his mind went blank? Saturday morning, they dressed in their best clothes, his same clean sneakers, but with his least worn pants. His mother in a simple, good dress she saved for special occasions. The conservatory was a big, old stone building covered in ivy. It looked like a castle of music. Inside, the halls echoed with the sounds of a dozen different instruments practicing behind closed-door scales on a violin, a trumpet's blare, the deep thump of a cello. It was a symphony of work. They were led to a small room with a piano, much smaller than the hotel's grand, but just as real. 3 people sat behind a table. A stern-looking woman with glasses. A man with a kind face and gentle eyes. And to their surprise, Mr. Thorne, he gave them a brief, businesslike nod, but said nothing. He was there as an observer, a guarantor of his word. Leo's mouth went dry. The fear was paralyzing. The woman with glasses spoke. "We understand you play by ear and have composed your own work. Please play for us." His mother gave his hand one last squeeze and then sat in a chair by the wall. Leo walked to the piano. He sat on the bench. He looked at the keys. They were just keys. This was just another piano. But the room was so quiet, so expectant. He thought he would play his piece, the one from the hotel. But as his hands hovered, a different feeling came. Not the sounds of home this time. The sounds of this week. The sound of his mother's hopeful voice on the phone. The sound of the cards sliding on the kitchen table. The sound of a door creaking open. It was a feeling of looking forward, not just remembering. He began to play. It started with a single clear note, much like the one in the hotel. But then it spiraled outward. The music wasn't sad or longing anymore. It was questioning, exploring. It had moments of brightness, like sunlight finding its way through a narrow window. It had runs of notes that sounded like hopeful racing thoughts. He used what he knew, the rhythms, the patterns, but he let the new feeling guide him. He played for maybe 5 minutes, and when he finished, the last note was bright and hanging, full of possibility. The silence in the room was different from the hotel's stunned silence. This was a professional silence, a considering one. The man with the kind face was the first to speak. "Your technique is unorthodox," he said slowly. "Your hand position is all your own. But your musicality, your ear for harmony, it is natural, instinctive." He turned to the woman with glasses. "He hears the music fully formed." The woman nodded, making a note on a paper. "The composition is structurally simplistic, but emotionally complex. It is a start, a remarkable raw start." She looked at Leo. "You have no formal training at all?" "No, ma'am," Leo whispered. She looked at Mr. Thorne, then back at Leo and his mother. "We have a preparatory program for young talents who show exceptional promise but need foundational work. It is competitive, and it requires dedication. There is a scholarship that covers tuition." She paused. "We would like to offer Leo a place in this program, starting next month." The air left Leo's lungs. He looked at his mother. She had both hands pressed to her chest, her eyes shut tight for a second, as if receiving a great gift. The rest of the meeting was a blur of detail schedules, materials, a list of things he would need. A simple notebook, a pencil, a metronome. They shook hands. Mr. Thorne finally approached as they were leaving. "You played something different today," he said to Leo. "Yes, sir." "Good," Mr. Thorne said. And for the second time, he almost smiled. "You shouldn't only play what you know. You should play what you hope for." He gave that same slight nod to Leo's mother. "Madam." And then he was gone, back into the world of business deals and spreadsheets, having brokered a deal of a different kind. On the walk home, the city seemed louder, brighter, bigger. The future, which had always been a straight, narrow path, now had a side road, a path leading into a forest of music and learning. It would be hard. There would be days of frustration, of feeling behind, of missing the simple joy of playing on his chalk floor. But as he took his mother's hand, Feeling the familiar roughness of her skin from years of work, he knew something for certain. He had played his truth for a room of strangers, and it had opened a door. Now, he had to learn how to walk through it. Not as a poor boy who touched a rich man's piano, but as a student, as a musician. The first single note had been pressed. Now the real song was beginning. The first sound wasn't a single note. It was a chord, a deep, rich gathering of notes that seemed to vibrate out from the piano's belly and wash over the quiet room. It wasn't the timid plink of a beginner. It was a sound full of shadow and substance, a statement. It hung in the air for a split second, a promise of something big. At the celebration table, the man who had been laughing the loudest, the one who started it all, felt his smirk freeze on his face. His wine glass, halfway to his lips, stopped moving. That one chord didn't sound like a joke. It sounded like the start of a storm. Then her hands began to move. What happened next was a kind of magic, the sort you don't expect to find in a restaurant on a random Thursday. The waitress Elena, her name tag said, though no one at the table was thinking of her name tag, now seemed to dissolve. The woman in the simple black clothes folded up and vanished. In her place sat a musician, her body connected to the instrument in a way that looked like a single, breathing creature. Her back, which had been straight and a little stiff when she walked over, now had a graceful curve to it. Her shoulders were loose. Her head tilted slightly, her ear leaning toward the keys as if she was listening to a secret they were telling her. And her hands were a revelation. Just minutes ago, they had been carrying heavy trays, scribbling orders, wiping down tables. Now they flew across the keyboard, not with frantic speed, but with a powerful, flowing certainty. Her fingers weren't hitting the keys. They were dancing with them, pulling music out of the wood and wire. The song wasn't something simple or popular. It was complicated, a river of music that swirled and jumped and dove. It had moments of gentle, heartbreaking melody that made the woman who wanted tiramisu feel a sudden, unexpected ache in her chest. That it would twist into sections of fierce, joyful energy, a cascade of notes so fast they seemed to blur together. It was old music, but it felt alive, telling a story of crowded cities and lonely nights and wild hope. About the manager near the front podium had been polishing a wine glass with a white cloth. He stopped. The cloth hung limp in his hand. His mouth was slightly open. He knew they had a piano. He'd helped move it in. He'd dusted it for years. He had no idea it could make sounds like this. He looked at the waitress, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time in the 3 years she'd worked for him. Who was this person? In the kitchen, the sounds were different. The hiss of the grill, the shouted order, the clang of a pot. But then the music seeped through the swinging doors. The head chef, a big man with a tattoo on his forearm, was plating a fish. He heard the first few bars, and his knife paused over the parsley. He looked up at his sous chef. They didn't say anything. They just listened. The dishwasher, a young guy with headphones usually blasting music, pulled one earphone out. He leaned against the sink, his hands still wet, and stared at the closed kitchen door. The frantic energy of the kitchen softened, just for a minute, into something like wonder. Back in the dining room, the other customers were caught in the same spell. The couple that had been quietly arguing in the corner, their words tense and sharp, just a few minutes before, were no longer looking at each other. Both were turned in their chairs, facing the piano. The woman's angry frown had smoothed away, replaced by a look of simple absorption. The man reached out, without thinking, and put his hand over hers on the table. She didn't pull away. An older man eating alone, who had been methodically working his way through a bowl of pasta while reading a book on his phone, put the phone down, screen side down. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, not because they were tired, but as if to clear them to better hear. He listened with his whole body, his head nodding slowly to a rhythm only he could feel deep inside the complex music, not all the little distractions of the restaurant. The clink of a fork, the rustle of a menu, a cough, they all melted away. The only thing that existed was the space between the listeners and the music flowing from the piano dot at the celebration table. The change was the most profound. The mood had been completely overturned. The loud, boisterous energy they had carried in with them was gone, blown away by the very first chord. They weren't smiling anymore. They weren't laughing. They were just listening. The woman who had asked for the tiramisu felt her eyes get a little wet. She wasn't sad. It was something else. The music was so beautiful, it physically hurt, in a good way, like seeing a perfect sunset. She glanced at her friend next to her and saw the same stunned look reflected back. The younger man who had joined in chanting, "Give us a song," now looked deeply embarrassed, but not for her. For himself. He felt his face grow warm. He had been part of the pressure, part of the crowd treating this as a game. He saw now, with total clarity, that it wasn't a game. This was serious. This was art. He slumped a little in his chair, feeling small. And Greg, the ringleader, the man whose idea this was, felt a strange cocktail of emotions churning in his gut. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a dawning, uncomfortable understanding. He had forced this. He had pushed and prodded a stranger to perform for his own amusement. He had expected a stumble, a fumble, a little moment of laughter at someone else's expense. He had not expected to be humbled. He watched her hands, those powerful, sure hands, and he thought about his own hands, which pushed paper and shook hands and pointed at things he wanted. He listened to the music, which spoke of a deep history of practice, of lonely hours, of a talent that was clearly a core part of who this person was. And he had treated it like a party trick. His face, already flushed from wine, now burned with a different kind of heat. It was shame. It was the clear, sharp understanding that he had profoundly misjudged a situation and a person. He couldn't take his eyes off her. The waitress was gone. In her place was an artist, and she was giving them all a gift they didn't deserve. The loudest man in the room had been utterly silenced, not by a command, but by a beauty so complete it left no room for his noise. The song built and built. It wasn't just one melody, but many, all weaving together. It would climb to a thrilling peak, where the notes seemed to tumble over each other in a joyful race, and then it would fall back to a single, pure, quiet line that was almost more powerful in its simplicity. She controlled it all. Every note was intentional. Every pause was filled with meaning. For Elena, sitting at the piano, the world outside the circle of light had shrunk almost nothing. The pressure, the awkwardness, the staring eyes, it had all melted away the moment her fingers connected with the keys. This was her language. This was where she didn't have to be polite, or efficient, or invisible. In this space, she could speak in emotions too big for words. The nervousness was gone. In its place was a fierce, quiet joy. A part of her, a very small part, acknowledged the irony. The man who had pressured her had, without knowing it, handed her back a piece of herself she kept hidden. He had unlocked the door to the room where her real self lived. And now she was showing that self to a room full of strangers, not because she had to, but because the music demanded to be let out. She didn't think about technique. She didn't think about the notes on a page. She felt the story in the music, the longing, the hustle, the bluesy ache, the triumphant soar. She let it move through her, from her heart, down her arms, and into her fingers. The piano was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was her partner, responding to every touch, every shift of weight, every whispered thought. She forgot she was in a restaurant. She forgot about the unpaid rent waiting at home, the tired feet, the polite smile she wore like a uniform. For these few minutes, she was free. She was whole. And the sound filling the room was the sound of that wholeness. A stunning, complicated, beautiful noise that held every single person in the room perfectly still and perfectly speechless. The music didn't just fill the room. It changed the air in it. That first, powerful chord had been a shock, like a curtain ripped aside to reveal something enormous. What followed was a journey, and everyone in the bistro was being swept along, whether they expected it or not. For Elena, the woman at the piano, the world had shrunk to the space between her hands and the keys. The polished black wood of the piano, the feel of the cool ivory under her fingertips, the familiar resistance of each hammer action key, this was her real world. The clatter of the kitchen, the smell of garlic, the weight of all those watching eyes. It all faded into a distant hum, like traffic heard from inside a sealed room. She wasn't thinking. Not in words, anyway. Her mind was a map of sound and muscle memory. A lifetime of practice had wired the music into her. Years of lessons that started when her feet couldn't reach the pedals. Countless hours alone in practice rooms, with peeling soundproofing on the walls, the metronome's tick her only company. The sacrifices, the missed parties in high school, the quiet envy of friends with easier paths, the constant, whispering doubt that asked if it was all worth it. All of it was in her hands now. The piece she played was a tapestry. It had threads of classical training, clear and precise as diamond. Woven through it were strands of something else, a raw, soulful blues feeling, a jazzy swing that made your foot want to tap, even as you sat utterly still. It was music that felt both old and brand new. It told stories without a single word. You could hear a busy city street in the quick, bustling runs up the keyboard. You could feel a deep, lonely longing in the slow, bending notes she pulled from the lower registers. Then it would burst into something joyful, a celebration that fizzed and sparkled. Her body moved with the music. It wasn't a performance. It was a conversation. Her shoulders rolled with the rhythm. Her head would tilt when the melody turned sweet and tender, as if she was sharing a secret with the piano. When the music grew fierce and complex, she leaned into it, her spine straight, her hands a confident blur. You could see the effort, but not struggle. It was the effort of a master, completely in control of something powerful. Back at the celebration table, the scene was frozen in a kind of beautiful shock. The man who had pushed for this Greg had forgotten his wine. The glass sat on the table, a dark red circle staining the white cloth beneath it from where he'd set it down too hard. His mouth was slightly open. All the easy confidence had drained from his face, replaced by a blank, wide-eyed astonishment. He was a man who solved problems with spreadsheets and loud talk. This was a language he didn't understand, a depth of skill he couldn't measure. He felt a hot flush creep up his neck. This wasn't embarrassment anymore. It was awe, mixed with a crushing sense of his own foolishness. He had tried to make a spectacle of someone, and instead, he was witnessing a spectacle that left him feeling small and deeply quiet. The woman next to him, the one who loved tiramisu, had a single tear tracing a slow path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. The music had tapped into a feeling she hadn't let herself feel in a long time, a pure, uncomplicated sadness that was also somehow beautiful. It wasn't about her life. It was about life itself, the beauty and the ache of it. She looked at the waitress, really looked, and saw not a server, but an artist pouring her history into the room. The younger man at the table, who had joined in the chanting, kept shaking his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in a kind of surrender. He played a little guitar. He knew what it took to get good. What he was hearing was on a different planet from good. This was a lifetime of dedication. He thought of his own guitar, sitting in the corner of his apartment, gathering dust. He felt a sharp pang of regret, and then a surge of inspiration so strong it almost made him get up and leave right then to go practice. Across the restaurant, the couple who had been arguing were now holding hands, their fingers laced tightly together on the tablecloth. Whatever their argument had been about money or chores or something one of them forgot to do, it seemed ridiculous now, silenced by the sheer scale of what they were hearing. The music was a reminder that there were bigger, more beautiful, more complicated things in the world than their small disagreement. They didn't speak. They just held on and listened, their earlier anger replaced by a shared, wordless wonder. The older man eating alone had put his book away entirely. He rested his chin on his folded hands, his eyes closed. A small, soft smile played on his lips. He was somewhere else. Maybe the music had taken him back to his youth, to a concert hall, or a smoky jazz club, or a memory of someone he once loved. The melody was a time machine just for him. Even the staff was caught. A busboy stood rooted near the kitchen doors, a heavy tub of dirty dishes balanced on his hip, forgotten. He was from a small town, and he'd never heard live music like this. It sounded like the movies, but real right here. The bartender had stopped polishing glasses. She leaned against the back counter, arms crossed, just watching. She'd served Elena a shift drink many times. They'd talked about easy things, the weather, rude customers, the schedule. She had never, not once, mentioned this. The manager was the most still of all. He stood like a statue by the podium, the reservation book forgotten. His mind was racing, but his body was calm. He was thinking about all the times he'd seen this quiet woman mop up a spilled drink without complaint. He thought about how she was always the first to wipe down the menus. He thought about the polite, almost shy way she said, "Behind you," in the crowded wait station. He felt a surge of something like protectiveness, and then a deep, profound respect. He had been her boss for years, and he had never known her at all. For Elena, the final section of the piece was approaching. The music began to climb again, not in a frantic rush, but with a grand, sweeping purpose. All the themes, the lonely melodies, the bustling rhythms, the bluesy sighs, they started to come together. It was like watching several rivers finally meet the sea. The sound became richer, fuller, more triumphant. Her fingers flew, but there was no panic in it. It was precision. It was power. She pressed the pedals with her feet, letting the notes blend and ring, filling every corner of the bistro with a glorious, vibrating sound. The final few bars were a series of bold, declaratory chords, each one landing with a weight that felt like a heartbeat dot, and then, with one last, ringing, magnificent harmony that seemed to hang in the air long after her hands had left the keys. It was over. The silence that followed was different from the silence before she played. That had been an empty quiet, a waiting quiet. This silence was thick. It was full. It was packed with the echo of the music and the shock of everyone in the room. It was the silence of people who have had the breath knocked out of them by something beautiful. Elena's hands came to rest softly in her lap. Her shoulders slumped, just a little, the energy draining out of her. She sat there for a moment in the pool of light, her back still to the room, her head bowed slightly. The connection was broken. The spell was over. The artist had finished speaking, and now the waitress had to come back. She took a slow, deep breath, steadying herself. The sounds of the restaurant began to seep back in the hum of the fridge, the distant clang from the kitchen. The world was returning to normal. But the room and everyone in it had been changed. No one moved. No one made a sound. They were all still trapped in that perfect, speechless moment, suspended between the last note and whatever was supposed to happen next. The silence was a living thing. It wasn't empty. It was heavy, full of the echo of the last magnificent chord that seemed to still be vibrating in the wood of the floor and the glass of the windows. For a long moment, no one remembered how to move. The waitress Elena sat perfectly still at the piano, her back to them all, her head bowed slightly as if in prayer or simple exhaustion. Then, a small, sharp sound broke the spell. It was a fork, slipping from the limp fingers of the woman at the celebration table who had wanted tiramisu. It hit the edge of her plate with a tiny clink. The sound was absurdly loud in the quiet. It seemed to wake everyone up at once. From the corner booth, the older man dining alone started it. He didn't cheer. He didn't whistle. He simply began to clap. It was slow, deliberate, respectful. Asterisk clap. Clap, clap. Each clap was solid and clear dot. It was like a signal. The couple who had been arguing joined in, their hands coming together in a sudden, grateful burst. The bartender behind the counter started clapping, a wide, amazed smile on her face. The busboy near the kitchen doors, finally remembering the tub of dishes on his hip, shuffled it to the floor with a thud so he could free his hands and applaud Dot. Then it swept through the room. It wasn't wild, rowdy applause like at a sports game. It was warmer than that, deeper. It was the kind of applause people give when they have been genuinely moved, when they need to say thank you with noise because words aren't enough. It filled the bistro with a rolling, thunderous sound. People were getting to their feet. Chairs scraped back. The entire restaurant was standing, all eyes on the single figure at the piano Dot at the celebration table. They were all standing too. The younger man was clapping so hard his palms stung. The woman was wiping her eyes with her napkin, then clapping again. Greg, the man who had started it all, was on his feet. His applause was the fiercest of all. He wasn't clapping for a show. He was clapping in apology, in respect, in sheer, unadulterated awe. His face was still flushed, but now with emotion. He looked like a man who had been shown a great truth he hadn't known he was missing. Elena heard the wave of sound behind her. It broke the final connection to the private world of the music. She was back in the restaurant, under the lights, in her work clothes. For a second, she just sat there, letting the applause wash over her. It had been so long since she had heard that sound for herself. Years. A tightness in her chest that she hadn't even noticed was there began to loosen. Slowly, she turned on the piano bench. The sight that met her eyes, the entire room standing, faces looking at her with admiration, not pity or amusement, made her breath catch. She wasn't used to being seen, not like this. A faint, surprised blush colored her cheeks. She gave a small, quick nod of her head, not a proud bow, but a humble acknowledgement. A simple thank you. She stood up. Her legs felt a little unsteady, as if she had just stepped off a boat onto solid land. She walked the few steps back from the piano, her movements hesitant again, the grace of the performer receding. She bent down and picked up the velvet rope from the floor. Her hands, which had just commanded the keyboard with such power, fumbled slightly with the simple brass hooks as she redraped it in front of the piano. It was a symbolic act. The instrument was going back to being furniture. The show was over. Dot as she turned fully to face the room. The applause began to soften, then slowly died away. People started to sit back down, but the atmosphere was completely different. The air buzzed with low, excited conversation. Everyone was talking about what they had just heard, gesturing towards the piano, looking at her with new eyes. She had to walk back through the dining room to get to her station. It felt like the longest walk of her life. As she passed the table with the older man, he looked up at her. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. That was a gift. She nodded again, unable to speak, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. The couple reached out as she passed. "Just incredible," the woman said, squeezing her husband's hand. Then she arrived at her station. Her notepad and apron were right where she had left them. They looked like artifacts from another life. She took a deep, steadying breath, smoothing her hands down the front of her black trousers. The manager was suddenly there beside her. He put a hand gently on her shoulder for just a second. He didn't say good job or anything like that. He just looked at her, his own eyes a little shiny, and gave her shoulder a slight, firm squeeze. It said everything. Asterisk, I had no idea. I am so sorry. I am so proud. Asterisk. Then he walked back to his podium, giving her space. All that was left was to return to her table. The celebration party was all sitting again, but the celebration had taken on a new, quieter tone. They watched her approach. The loud, boisterous group had vanished. In its place were 6 people who looked thoughtful, even a little solemn. Elena stopped at the edge of their table. She picked up her notepad and pen from the service stand. She looked at them, her expression calm, professional. The blush was gone. She was the waitress again. But she was a waitress who had just rewritten the rules of the evening. She met Greg's eyes. He looked back at her, his earlier bravado completely gone. He looked earnest, almost boyish in his regret. Elena didn't mention the music. She didn't wait for their compliments or their apologies. That wasn't her role. Her role was to serve. But now she served from a place of unshakable strength. She had shown them who she was, and that knowledge sat quietly in the space between them. She picked up the dessert menu that had been sitting, forgotten, in the center of the table. She held it out, not to anyone in particular. Now, she said. Her voice was the same low, pleasant tone as before, but it carried a new weight, a calm authority that hadn't been there 15 minutes ago. Were you ready for that dessert menu? It was the most ordinary question in the world. But in that moment, after everything, it was the most perfect thing she could have said. It was a lifeline back to normalcy. It was a gentle, graceful way of saying, the performance is over. I am still your waitress. We can all move on. For a second, no one at the table spoke. They were all still absorbing the whiplash from pressure, to shock, to awe, and now back to the simple choice between chocolate cake and tiramisu. Then Greg cleared his throat. He didn't make a big speech. He didn't try to apologize profusely, which would have made it about him again. He just looked at her, and his voice was softer, more respectful than it had been all night. Yes, he said. Yes, we are. Thank you. And as Elena began to describe the special dessert, a pear and almond tart, the table listened with a focus they hadn't given to the entire dinner. They weren't just listening to a description of food. They were listening to her, the woman who had just taken their thoughtless request and turned it into a moment they would never, ever forget. The stunning talent had left the room speechless, and now, in the gentle hum of its return to normal, a deep and lasting respect had taken speechlessness's place. The rest of the night moved in a kind of pleasant, dreamy, slow motion. The energy in the bistro had been permanently altered. Where before there had been the usual clatter and separate conversations, now there was a shared, buzzing warmth. People kept glancing towards the piano, then towards the waitress, as if to confirm that what they'd heard had actually happened. At the celebration table, they ordered dessert, 2 tiramisus, a chocolate torte, the pear tart, and 3 spoons for everyone to share. But they ate quietly, thoughtfully. The loud jokes were gone. Instead, they talked in low voices about the music. What was that piece? I've never heard anything like it. She's a professional. She has to be. The young man who played guitar was on his phone, trying to hum a snippet into a music recognition app with no success. The piece was too complex, too personal. It was hers. Greg, the ringleader, was mostly silent. He ate his share of the desserts, without really tasting them. His mind was elsewhere. He kept replaying the last hour in his head, his own demanding voice, the waitress's reluctant walk to the piano, and then that seismic shift as the first chord hit the room. He felt a shame that was clean, not dirty. It wasn't about being caught in a mistake. It was the simple, clear awareness that he had acted without seeing the whole person in front of him. He had turned a human being into a bit of entertainment for his evening, and she had responded by showing him a depth of soul that humbled him. He watched her as she moved between her other tables, pouring water, clearing plates. She moved the same way as before, efficient and quiet, but he saw it differently now. He saw the strength in her hands, the patience in her posture. He saw an artist paying her rent. When the bill came, Greg took it without letting anyone else see. He calculated a generous tip on the total, then paused. It felt wrong. Money, even a lot of it, felt like the wrong language for what had just happened. It was like trying to pay for a sunset. But it was the only language the restaurant spoke. He took out his pen, added a significant amount more, and then, below the total, he wrote 3 words on the credit card slip. Thank you. Truly. He didn't sign his name. It didn't matter. As the group gathered their coats, the woman who had cried approached Elena near the service station. Excuse me, she said, her voice a little shy. That was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years. You have an incredible gift. Elena, who was refilling sugar bowls, stopped and gave her a soft, tired smile. That's very kind of you to say. Thank you. It was a polite, professional response, but her eyes were warmer than before. Can I ask? What was it you played? It was an arrangement, Elena said simply. A bit of Gershwin mixed with some things of my own. It's just something I play. The woman just nodded, understanding that some things can't be neatly labeled. She reached out impulsively and squeezed Elena's arm. Well, thank you for sharing it. Then she joined her friends at the door. One by one, the other tables left. Nearly every person stopped by the manager's podium on their way out, not to complain, but to marvel. You have a treasure in that waitress, the older man said, pulling on his hat. That wasn't a dinner. That was an event. The couple just grinned. We're telling everyone about this place, the husband said. Finally, the bistro was empty. The kitchen crew had left, the dishwasher was rattling through the last racks, and the busboys were mopping the floors. The manager was at the back office doing paperwork. Elena was at her station, doing her closing side work, wiping down menus, restocking condiments, rolling silverware into napkins. The manager came out and leaned against the counter. He watched her for a minute, her hands moving swiftly, methodically. You know, he said, his voice breaking the quiet, my wife and I went to the symphony last month. Tickets were a fortune. It was nice, very polished. Elena looked up, but didn't say anything. He continued, looking at the piano. What you did tonight. That had more heart in it than the whole second violinist section. He shook his head, a little embarrassed by his own words. What I'm trying to say is, you should be on a stage, not wiping down ketchup bottles. Elena finished rolling a set of silverware and placed it neatly in the bin. She let out a long, slow breath. Stages are complicated, she said, her voice low. They have expectations, schedules, lots of people talking. This. She gestured vaguely around the quiet dining room. This pays the bills. And sometimes it's quiet. The manager understood. He wasn't a man of big artistic dreams, but he was a man who understood practicality, and he heard the history of disappointment in her simple words. Well, he said, pushing off the counter, for what it's worth, you're the best closer I've got. And if you ever want to, I don't know, play a little on a slow Sunday night, just for the ambience. The piano's there. He offered her a small, crooked smile. No pressure. Ever again. She smiled back, a real one that reached her eyes. Thanks. I'll think about it. He nodded and went back to his office. Alone again, Elena finished her work. As she carried the last bin of rolled silverware to the back, she passed the piano. She stopped. The velvet rope was back in place. The spotlight was off, leaving it in shadow. It was just a piece of furniture again, but it wasn't, not really. Not anymore. Not to her, and not to anyone who was here tonight. She didn't sit down. She didn't play. She just rested her fingertips lightly on the top of the polished wood near the lock. It was a touch of gratitude. The piano had been her ally. It had spoken for her when words failed. It had reminded her, and everyone else, of who she was beneath the uniform. She collected her things from the staff closet, a worn coat, a scarf, a bag with a library book inside. She clocked out, the machine giving a dull beep. The manager waved from the office. See you tomorrow, Elena. Good night, she said, stepping out the back door into the cool night air. The city sounds hit her cars, distant sirens, the hum of a streetlight. It was a different world from the warm, focused world of the piano. She walked towards the bus stop, her thoughts finally quiet. She didn't feel like a hero. She didn't feel like she'd won anything. She felt tired, the good kind of tired that comes after using your muscles for something real. Mostly, she felt a small, quiet sense of peace. A piece of herself she kept locked away, a piece that sometimes felt lonely and forgotten, had been let out to breathe. And instead of being laughed at or ignored, it had been seen. It had been heard. And for a few minutes, it had connected with other people. That was a gift, both given and received. At the bus stop, she thought of Greg's face, the shock melting into awe. She thought of the woman with the tear on her cheek. She thought of the standing applause. They hadn't just applauded a performance. They had applauded herself. That was a rare thing. It would fuel her for a long time. The bus arrived with a sigh of air brakes. She climbed on, paid her fare, and found a seat by the window. As the bus pulled away, she could see the glow of the bistro sign fading behind her. Back inside, the manager was turning off the last lights. He paused by the piano, a dust cloth in his hand. He didn't dust it. Instead, he pulled the velvet rope off its hooks and folded it over his arm. He left it off. He decided then and there that the rope was unnecessary. The piano wasn't just a decoration anymore. It was a possibility. It was a promise that beauty could happen in ordinary places, from the most unexpected people. And you didn't put a rope in front of a promise. He turned off the light, locking the door behind him. The story of the night was over. But the echo of the music and the quiet lesson it carried, that you can never know the whole symphony inside another person, would linger much, much longer. For everyone involved, it was a night they would simply call, "Remember that time at the Italian place?" And then they would fall silent, smiling, because some things are too real for words.